By 9 a.m., Red Haven, Arizona, already felt like high noon. Heat shelled the desert flat and bright, mirage shivering above a two-lane blacktop that hadn't seen a fresh stripe in years. The Humvee bumped along at 20, engine humming, tires popping bits of gravel into the mesquite. Staff Sergeant Ethan Cole had one elbow in the open window, the other hand resting near the radio, eyes sweeping the endless tan. He didn't talk much on patrol. He listened. To wind, to engine, to the small things that didn't belong. The thing that didn't belong broke from the scrub like a shot of smoke and bone. German shepherd, underweight, coat scorched in places, one forepaw raw enough to make you wince. He came straight at the Humvee, not wild, not panicked, purposeful. He planted himself dead center, legs splayed, chest heaving. He didn't bark. He held Ethan's gaze through the windshield with a steady, impossible kind of plea, then pivoted and limped away 3 strides before looking back. "Brake," Ethan said. Corporal Mason Ward was already on it. Dust rolled past the bumper. In back, Lieutenant Caleb Grant muttered into the manifest, then looked up hard. "Stray," Caleb said. "We keep moving." Mason leaned forward, cap brim cutting the glare. "That head turn," he said softly. "He's asking." "Dogs don't ask," Caleb said. Ethan pushed the door open and stepped into the heat. The shepherd didn't flinch. Up close, Ethan saw the collar, cracked leather, buckle warped by fire. There was a faint scorch across the dog's shoulder, the kind that says he'd been where heat lived too long. The eyes were the kind Ethan knew from another continent, working eyes, taking everything in, scanning, deciding. "You alone, buddy?" Ethan crouched low to shorten himself, palms open. The dog lifted his burnt paw and set it on Ethan's boot, just once, like punctuating a sentence. Then he turned and moved into the brush, pausing to look back. Caleb stepped out, scanning the horizon. "We're not here to chase pets, Cole. We've got a grid." 10 minutes, Ethan said, voice even. "If I'm wrong, we lose 10 minutes. Mason ghosted a grin. "If he's right, we lose our place in the dog's fan club." Caleb exhaled through his nose, then nodded once. 10. They followed. The shepherd, someone's shepherd, not a stray, threaded the mesquite like he'd run the path in a better life. He kept his limp tight, conserving motion, conserving pain. Ethan read the gate. Pain managed, mind fixed. Twice the dog stopped and looked over his shoulder. Twice Ethan caught up and let him reestablish lead. Leadership looks like a lot of things. Sometimes it's a dog deciding how much you can handle. They cut west toward a dry wash. Mason tapped Ethan's arm, pointed at the ground. Blood, yes, but not a smear. Drops spaced oddly even, like beads spilled from a hand that tried to keep holding on. Human. Ethan didn't say it out loud. He didn't have to. The dog kept going. They hit a lip of sandstone and slid down into the wash. The shepherd lifted his head, nostrils tasting wind, ears angling to the left. Ethan felt it before he placed it. Air cooled by shadow, a faint metallic taint like old wire in sun. He stopped, hand out to halt Mason. The dog did something then that didn't fit Stray at all. He cut back behind the Humvee's line and circled to the road they'd just left, nose low, tail stiff. "Where's he going?" Mason asked. "Let him work," Ethan said. His voice went quiet without trying to. He recognized the vector of thought in the dog's body. Scouts had moved that way before IED lanes. Different war, same language. The shepherd reached the edge of blacktop and pawed at something small and ugly glinting in the heat haze. Mason jogged up, squinted, then cursed under his breath. "Caltrops," he said. "Fresh drop. 3-pronged tire killers, homemade from cut rebar and attitude. Scattered across the shoulder exactly where a Humvee swings wide to give mesquite a polite berth. One more minute and one of their tires would have shredded clean. Out here, a flat could be an inconvenience or a setup. Caleb was beside them now. He looked from metal stars to dog, jaw tight. The shepherd stood silent, head lowered over the nearest spike like he'd pinned a snake. "That twist enough for you, Lieutenant?" Mason said lightly, though the sound didn't carry to his eyes. Caleb didn't answer. He stepped back, keyed the radio twice. "Grant, possible road sabotage north of Marker 9, marking position." The shepherd, business handled, turned again toward the wash and that thin, insistent scent of hurt. He pushed on, faster now that they were moving behind him with intent. Ethan's mind flickered, unhelpful and uninvited, to Ranger, the brown and black streak that used to match his stride in gravel riverbeds 10 years and 2 lifetimes ago. He tamped the memory down, but something in his chest loosened. The dog ahead didn't know about ghosts. He was one. They climbed out of the wash and into shoulder-high rabbit brush. The heat was a hand on the back of the neck. In a seam of shade where a collapsed windmill threw its bones across the ground, the shepherd stopped so abruptly Ethan almost walked into him. The dog's ears went forward, then flattened. He took one step, paused, and looked to Ethan, not past him. "What do you have?" Ethan whispered. The answer came in scent long before sound. Human. Sick. A sweet rot paper smell like air inside a shut-up room. The shepherd eased forward and cut toward a low rise. Beyond it, set back from the wash behind a screen of creosote, sat a house that had started losing the fight some time ago. Paint long gone, porch sagging, window black as an eye that didn't blink. Caleb's hand came up. "We stop. We call it in. We don't breach an unknown structure." The dog walked to the door and pressed his shoulder to the warped wood, then dropped his chest and slid a paw under as far as raw pads allowed. He didn't make a sound. He didn't have to. The sound he was not making lifted the hair on Ethan's arms. Mason moved to the window, glanced in, and hissed between his teeth. Movement on the couch, single, breathing shallow. There's a bowl on the table and a second bowl on the floor. Caleb lifted the sat phone, hunting a bar like a thirsty man hunts a spigot. Nothing. He looked at Ethan. The 10 minutes were gone. Something else clocked in. "Protocol," Caleb said, but it sounded less like a rule and more like a habit he wasn't sure fit anymore. "Someone's dying," Ethan said. Not loud. Certain. The shepherd swung his head toward Ethan, and in that split second you could have sworn the dog understood the word choice. Not someone. Mine. Caleb's jaw worked. "Fine. Cole, you and Ward on me. Quick check, in and out. We hold it clean until medevac." They stacked on the door. The shepherd edged away just enough to give them space, then put his body beside the jam like a fourth man on the team. Ethan felt an old current run through him as easily as sweat. A team is whoever shows up and doesn't quit. 3, 2, Ethan kicked. Wood gave like wet bread. Air fell out of the room in a rush of dust and heat. The smell hit all at once. Stale water, aspirin, sunburnt fabric, human fear held too long. They swept the room. Couch, thin woman, late 20s, 30s maybe. Skin too pale under desert light, breath shallow enough to lose, pupils sluggish. A limp hand brushed against fur and found it without looking. The shepherd curled his body along the couch, shoulder to shin. He lowered his head until his muzzle rested against her ankle and let out a long, steady exhale that smoothed the jagged shape of the room. "Hey," Mason said gently, kneeling. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her lips moved. No sound at first, then a scrap of voice, paper dry. "Don't take him." "Nobody's taking him," Ethan said. The promise came out before he decided to make it. He checked pulse, counted, checked skin turgor, and felt his mouth go hard. Severe dehydration. Maybe more. Caleb found a whisper of signal at the window and started talking in the clipped cadence of a man borrowing time. Coordinates: 1 adult female. Possible autoimmune crisis. Immediate evacuation. Copy. Mason eased a canteen cap to the woman's mouth. She swallowed like it hurt and kept trying anyway. The shepherd watched that motion with a soldier's economy, eyes sliding to Ethan, then back to her throat working. Ethan glanced around. The table in the kitchenette held a single plate, a fork set neatly at 10 and 4, and a water bowl on the floor that had been rinsed and refilled more carefully than the house had been cleaned. On the counter, a burned, twisted bit of leather lay under a magnet. He lifted it. It had been a collar. Tag once. The heat had erased most of the letters, but not all. Enough to make a truth snap tight across the scene. Shad. He didn't say the name aloud. The dog knew it already. Outside, a wind line moved across the flat and rattled the dead windmill bones. Somewhere far off, a siren tried the desert on for size and found it too big to fill. The shepherd's ears tracked the sound and then settled. He did not leave the woman. He did not take his eyes off the doorway either. "Cole," Caleb said from the window, voice lower now. "Ambulance is 20 out." Ethan nodded. He let the burned tag sit in his palm for a beat longer, then slipped it into his pocket, not as evidence, not as leverage, just so it wouldn't get lost again. He looked at the dog. "We've got her," he said. The shepherd didn't blink, didn't wag, didn't do any of the things people think dogs do to make us feel better. He simply shifted a half-inch closer to the woman's shin, put his paw on the frayed couch fabric, and held the room steady with his presence. There are moments when an animal takes command without rank or voice. This was one. Caleb, who had started the morning with a rule book in his chest pocket, took one long look at the dog and the woman and then at Ethan. Something in his face eased, like a fist unclenching. 10 minutes, he said softly, almost to himself. "Right." Mason glanced at Ethan. "You think he stopped us from shredding a tire because he's smart, or because he's used to saving people who don't know they need saving yet?" "Yes," Ethan said. Outside, the siren grew a little louder, dragging help toward a house the map had forgotten. Inside, the shepherd kept his vow without words. He wouldn't leave. Not until the miracle he'd started made it the rest of the way. The siren was still far enough away to sound like a rumor when the room tightened around Ethan. The shepherd had posted himself along Laura Bennett's shins, not touching more than necessary, just anchoring her to the world. His eyes flicked toward the open door, then back to Ethan like he was running a checklist. "Color's coming back," Mason said, watching the slow rise of Laura's ribs. "She's fighting." Caleb stood by the busted window, radio to his ear, eyes doing the geometry of approach and extraction. He had protocols stacked in his head, layers on layers. He also had sweat running down both temples. No one mentioned it. Ethan crouched, level with the dog's face. The collar was a ruin, the tag melted, but up close he could see the line where good leather used to lie against a healthy neck. This animal hadn't started broken. Something had done the breaking. "You with her from the start, Shadow?" he asked, feeling the name settle out of the air. The shepherd looked at him. Not quite a nod, not human, something older and cleaner than that. Ethan's chest tightened against an old seam. He had trained himself not to chase those seams anymore. Today, they chased him. "Caleb," Mason called softly. "Smell that?" Ethan caught it too. Not the old paper rot of a sealed room. Sharper, faint but insistent. Propane. His gaze snagged on the patched heater in the corner, a vented unit that had seen too many winters and too few repairs. The pilot flame flickered a fraction too big. "Everyone out," Caleb said, voice slicing the air. "We get cross-ventilation. Ward, back door. Cole, front. We make a tunnel." Mason moved. Ethan went for the front, shoved the door wide and felt thick heat crawl and lift as air began to change. The shepherd rose in one motion, pressed a shoulder to Laura like a promise, then trotted to the heater and sat, body rigid, eyes on the little blue flame. He didn't whine. He looked at Ethan again and tilted his head at the control knob. It wasn't a trick, it was a point, a trained point. "You're kidding me," Mason whispered. "He's alerting." Ethan turned the knob off. The flame died. The smell thinned. The room exhaled. Small twist, precise. The kind that saves people who will never know how close they were. Caleb's look was quick but honest. Noted. They worked the place like Ethan liked to work a problem. Simple first, then the edges. Mason found a cracked window with one working latch. Caleb found a towel that didn't smell like despair and soaked it for Laura's forehead. Ethan found a photo frame face down behind the couch and set it upright without reading the past in it. Shadow left the heater and came back to Laura, laying along her calves to give weight without pressure. He watched Ethan the way Ranger used to watch him in the crouch before the run. Waiting for the next job, prepared to accept it without fanfare. "Ranger," Ethan heard himself say, and the word dropped him into another desert like a trapdoor. He was 24 and knew old at the same time, Afghanistan bright and merciless, over a village that never appeared on the right map. Ranger was at heel on his left, a brown-black line of coiled intention, tongue out because tongues have to be somewhere, eyes raking the world for the thing that didn't belong. They found a seam of disturbed soil by a culvert. Ethan's life, all of it, boiled down to a hand signal he gave without thinking. Back. Ranger took it and then cocked his head toward a second seam 3 feet to the right that Ethan hadn't seen. He held that invisible line like a man holds a door for someone he loves. The device took Ranger and not Ethan. That felt like cowardice for a year, and then it felt like theft, and then it settled into something like grief that had nowhere practical to go. Ethan learned to bury that kind of thing under schedules and sand. "Cole," Mason said, voice low. "With me." Ethan blinked back into Red Haven. Mason was at the kitchen counter, holding up a folded sheet of paper found in a ceramic jar. Invoice from a mobile vet 2 towns over. Minimum vaccine, pack no client name written in. Cash sale. The date was 3 months back, 2 days after a storm that had filled every ditch in Red Haven with red broth and sent garbage rolling down Main Street like slow fish. She bought shots for him before she bought herself groceries. Mason said, "Any doubt he's family?" There wasn't. The shepherd shifted his head to watch the doorway. The sound of tires on gravel grew distinct. Shadow rose and moved 2 steps, then stopped and did something subtle that rearranged Ethan's understanding of him another inch. He turned sideways to the couch, chest toward the door, body between Laura and anyone coming through. Not a threat. A block. The old K9 trainers called it guardian posture. Shadow fell into it like muscle memory. Ethan tested a thought he told himself was dumb even as it formed. He pitched his voice down, not loud. "Such." The shepherd's ears tipped forward. He didn't launch into a pattern, didn't tear the room up, but he drew a slow inhale and touched nose to floor along the couch, then the doorway threshold, then back to the heater. Each stop a single second, then return to Laura. A clean search loop. Not chaotic, trained. Mason's eyebrows rose. "German commands?" "He just worked on search. Or he just read my posture," Ethan said, tamping down the jolt that ran his spine. He tried again, quieter. "Sits." Shadow sat. Caleb watched from the window, all the math in his face briefly replaced by something like curiosity. "So he's not random." "Nothing about him is random," Mason said. "He's a metronome with fur." Footsteps on the porch. The paramedics were there, a woman and a man in green polos and desert boots. The woman clocked Shadow first. She didn't reach for him. She lowered her height and let her eyes slide to Laura instead of trying to make friends. Professionals read each other even when the other wears fur. "We'll need the aisle," she said. Shadow glanced to Ethan. Ethan lifted 2 fingers, palm down. Bleib. Shadow held. The woman caught it and didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth warmed. They moved Laura to the stretcher. She woke enough to try to fight, fingers scrabbling for fur. Shadow stepped in, pressed his head to her hand, let her anchor, then released when Ethan gave him one quiet, steady, good. Outside on the porch, heat hit like a wall again. The ambulance doors swung open. The woman paramedic looked to Ethan. "We can't transport with him unsecured. Liability, Humvee right behind you," Caleb said. "You'll see him in your mirror." Shadow heard none of that. He had eyes only for Laura. He placed his front paws on the lip of the ambulance 1 second too long and then dropped back, trotting to the Humvee as if he'd grown up riding shotgun. He jumped into the footwell and then onto the seat when Mason patted it. He set his chest on the console and fixed his gaze down the ambulance's rear doors like he could will them not to close without him. Caleb slid into the driver's seat. He hesitated, then reached for the mirror charm that wasn't there and steadied himself on the wheel instead. "You two in?" "Copy," Ethan said, hand on Shadow's collar that wasn't really a collar anymore. He felt the dog's pulse through scar tissue and remembered how Ranger's heartbeat had felt in his palm before a sweep. Alive has a rhythm you never forget. They rolled. Out past the dead windmill and onto the blacktop that still held the threat of iron stars in the shoulder. Caleb kept to the center lane like the road itself could be persuaded to be safe if he showed it. Respect. Shadow kept a constant pressure against the console, eyes never leaving the ambulance. Halfway to town, Mason cleared his throat. "Ethan, you said a name back there." "Did I?" "Ranger." Ethan watched the white box ahead, watched the desert spool by, watched a coil in his chest he had fed for years loosen another fractional turn. "He saved me," he said finally. "He didn't get saved." Mason nodded once. "Looks to me like this one is trying to even the score." Caleb said nothing. He didn't need to. The way his knuckles had eased on the wheel, the way he adjusted the convoy distance to keep the ambulance close enough for Shadow to see and far enough for Shadow not to panic when the doors rattled, said he was taking his turn at learning without an argument. As they neared Red Haven's clinic, a call popped onto Caleb's radio from County Patrol. Road sabotage report logged north of Marker 9. Possible follow along the rail spur west. Be advised. "Caltrops aren't the point," Mason said. "They're a hello." "From who?" Caleb asked. "Whoever counted on a flat tire to make 3 Marines predictable." Shadow shifted then, a small adjustment that put his head against Ethan's shoulder for exactly 2 breaths. It was nothing. It was everything. He didn't need words to say what a good handler hears anyway. "Stay with me, and I'll get you there. Stay with her, and I'll get you both home." Ethan put his palm to the dog's head and felt the scar along the ear edge, an old cut healed rough. He didn't pull away. He didn't offer platitudes. He let the contact be a promise he would have sworn off saying out loud. "Okay, Shadow," he said. "We're with you." Ahead, the clinic's low roof line rose out of the mirage. Behind, the house receded into desert glare and memory. In the small space of the Humvee cab, among the clatter and the heat and the breath of an animal who had decided to lead, 3 men and a dog crossed a line none of them could name yet. It felt like losing something heavy and gaining something that weighed the same in a better place. The German shepherd pressed forward, muscles taut beneath its scorched coat, tail stiff as an arrow. Every few steps it glanced back at them as if to make sure they were still coming. The Arizona sun was merciless overhead, and the desert air shimmered with heat, but the dog moved with a purpose that cut through exhaustion. "Blood," Mason muttered, pointing at a thin, dark streak smeared along the edge of a rock. Ethan knelt to inspect it, dry, brown around the edges. The dog lowered its head, sniffed once, and kept going. Caleb's voice came from behind, clipped and uneasy. "We're going a long way off patrol route. Command isn't going to like this." Ethan didn't answer. The shepherd's gait reminded him too much of Rangers, focused, certain, like it knew something no human could. And in Afghanistan, trusting Rangers' instincts had saved their team more than once. Ethan could almost feel that old connection humming in his bones, the pull that told him to keep following. The terrain shifted from flat sand to jagged scrubland. Creosote bushes tore at their uniforms. The dog darted through thorny brush, barely slowing, its paws kicking up dust. Mason cursed under his breath as a mesquite branch raked his arm. "That dog's running like the devil's on its heels," he said, but there was a trace of admiration in his tone. They came over a rise and saw it, a faded line of footprints leading toward a stand of weather-beaten pines. Beside them, a trail of small, uneven shoe prints, and more blood. Ethan's pulse quickened. The shepherd reached the trees and vanished into shadow. The Marines hurried after it, weaving between trunks until the forest broke open to reveal a small, half-collapsed cabin clinging to the lip of a dry arroyo. The roof sagged in the middle, and one shutter flapped loosely in the wind. The dog trotted to the front porch and barked, once sharp and commanding, then again and again, its voice echoing against the canyon walls. Ethan stepped up first. The boards groaned beneath his boots. Through a crack in the warped doorframe, he caught a glimpse of movement inside. "Clear?" Mason asked, his rifle already at the low ready. "Not sure," Ethan said quietly, easing the door open. The smell hit him first, stale air mixed with something faintly metallic, and underneath it, the unmistakable scent of illness. A woman lay slumped on a threadbare couch, skin pale against the dark fabric, lips dry. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a struggle. Beside her, on a crate serving as a table, were prescription bottles, most empty, scattered among crumpled tissues and a tipped-over glass of water. The shepherd slipped past Ethan, nosed gently at the woman's arm, then looked up at him with eyes that said everything. "She's why I came." Mason scanned the room quickly. Place is abandoned except for her. Looks like she's been here a while. Ethan crouched, checking her pulse. Weak, but steady. She stirred at his touch, eyes flickering open for a second before closing again. Caleb's voice was low, but tense. "We need to call this in. She needs medevac. Now." Ethan glanced at the dog, who had settled beside her, chest rising and falling in time with hers. He'd seen loyalty in dogs before, but this was something else. As Mason stepped outside to radio for assistance, Ethan's gaze caught on a photo frame lying face down on the floor. He picked it up, brushing away dust. In the picture, the woman stood smiling in front of this very cabin, a younger version of herself, with her arm around a man in a faded Marine uniform. And at their feet, Ethan froze, was a German shepherd, bright-eyed and whole, the spitting image of the one lying here now. Except the photo looked like it was taken years ago. The dog nudged his knee as if urging him to understand, and a cold ripple ran down Ethan's spine. This wasn't just a random rescue. The shepherd had brought them to someone it knew, someone it had been protecting, maybe for years. And that meant this story went far deeper than any of them had guessed. Caleb's voice was clipped, almost metallic through the comms. "We wait. Protocol says we secure the perimeter. Call in medics and—" Ethan didn't let him finish. The dog, Shadow, was pacing in tight, frantic circles at the cabin door, nails scraping the warped wood, a sharp whine breaking into barks that seemed to ricochet off the canyon walls. Something in Ethan's gut twisted. He'd heard that kind of bark before. Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 2 minutes before an IED took Ranger from him. It wasn't just noise. It was a code, urgent and absolute. "Forget protocol," Ethan muttered, then drove his shoulder into the door. The frame gave with a splintering crack. Dust billowed out, tasting like rot and mildew. Shadow shot past him, paws skidding on the warped floorboards. The dog didn't hesitate. He pressed himself protectively against the figure slumped on a sagging sofa, a low rumble rising from his chest at their intrusion. Ethan's eyes adjusted. A woman lay there, skin pale against tangled auburn hair, her chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. A portable oxygen tank sat empty at her side, tubing twisted like discarded thread. On the cluttered coffee table, half-empty pill bottles, unopened mail, and a weathered photograph of the same dog curled beside her on a sunny porch. "She's alive," Ethan said, already kneeling to check her pulse. Weak, but there. Caleb stood in the doorway, jaw tight. "We don't know what we're walking into. Could be drugs. Could be she dies if we stand here arguing," Ethan snapped. He ripped open his field kit. Mason was already at his side, handing over saline and a portable drip. Shadow didn't move except to press his head closer to her ribs, as if willing her heart to keep going. Ethan worked quickly, lifting her chin, clearing her airway, slipping the oxygen mask from his own kit over her face. A soft gasp escaped her lips, the kind that felt like the first crack in ice. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Ethan kept his voice low, steady. Her eyelids fluttered. Then, in a rasp, barely more than breath, she whispered, "Laura." "Bennett." Her gaze darted to Shadow, and for a flicker of a second, fear lanced through her expression. She grabbed Ethan's sleeve weakly. "Don't let them take him." Ethan glanced at Mason, whose brows had shot up. "Who's them?" Mason asked. But Laura's focus tunneled entirely to the German shepherd still pressed against her side. Her hand fumbled toward Shadow's ear, and the dog leaned in, whining softly. Outside, the distant thump of helicopter blades grew louder. Medevac was inbound. Caleb's voice over the comm was tight, impatient. "Team 2 is on approach. Let's move her out." Ethan met Mason's eyes. They didn't need to say it out loud. Something about them wasn't just paranoia. Whoever she feared was real enough to make her plead for a dog's safety while half-conscious. They rigged a field stretcher and lifted her, Shadow refusing to leave her side. When Caleb tried to shoo him back, the shepherd stepped forward, teeth flashing in a silent warning. Ethan laid a hand on the dog's shoulder. "He comes with us," Ethan said, voice flat. Caleb hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Fine. But if that animal bites anyone—" "He won't," Ethan cut in, eyes never leaving the dog's. As they moved toward the clearing for the incoming bird, Shadow trotted alongside, never letting his flank drift more than inches from Laura's arm. The wind from the rotors whipped dust into their eyes, but the dog's gaze stayed locked forward, ears pricked, as if he knew the fight for her life wasn't over, just moving to the next battlefield. And Ethan, for the first time in years, felt that old, dangerous pull in his chest. The one that came when you realized a dog wasn't just an animal in your care. He was your partner. And partners didn't quit. The Red Haven Field Hospital was a patchwork of khaki canvas and generator hum, the air inside thick with antiseptic and the low murmurs of medics moving from cot to cot. Ethan sat in the metal folding chair beside Laura Bennett's bed, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the woman's pale, sunken face. Shadow lay curled at her side, head resting gently against her ribs, one amber eye watching Ethan as if weighing whether he could be trusted. Laura's voice was hoarse, but steady enough to cut through the bustle. "My husband's name was Staff Sergeant Daniel Bennett," she began, her fingers absently combing through the fur behind Shadow's ears. "We were stationed in Nevada. He deployed twice. On the third tour, he didn't come home." She paused, swallowing as if each word scraped her throat. Ethan glanced at Mason, who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Caleb stood by the foot of the bed, his regulation posture intact, but his eyes less rigid than usual. "They sent me the folded flag," Laura continued. and a form letter. I thought, maybe at least the benefits would help me stay afloat. But I made the mistake of moving back to Red Haven to be closer to my sister. New address, new nightmare. Paperwork got lost. Calls went unanswered. And then one day, my VA account was just gone. Her lips tightened, and Ethan noticed the faint tremor in her hands. By the time I figured out how to appeal, I was already in debt. Couldn't afford the treatments for my lupus anymore. Some days, even walking to the mailbox felt like a deployment. Shadow lifted his head, as if sensing her body weaken. The dog pressed closer, his steady weight like a life preserver. Laura's gaze softened. Then came the sandstorm, she said. Out by the old mining road. I was trying to get to a free clinic when my car broke down. That's when I saw him. Her smile was faint but real now, aimed at Shadow. He was half buried in the grit, coughing, ribs showing. No tags, no collar. I could have sworn he'd been abandoned for days. I pulled him into the car, wrapped him in my jacket and, well, I guess we rescued each other. Ethan's throat tightened. In the half-light of the tent, Shadow's coat gleamed like polished onyx, his eyes sharp but calm, eyes that didn't just look at you, but into you. Ethan knew that look. It was the same one Ranger had given him before every mission, an unspoken pact. I'm here, no matter what. You live out there alone? Mason asked, breaking the silence. Laura nodded. The cabin was my uncle's hunting place. It's all I had left. Shadow learned quick, fetching things, watching the perimeter. He'd alert me when my fever spiked. Sometimes he'd even nudge me awake if my breathing got shallow at night. I don't think I'd be here if not for him. Ethan leaned back, his jaw tight. And nobody from the VA checked in? No local outreach? Nothing, she said flatly. They only send mail. I can't always get into town to collect it. The last letter I got was a warning about repossessing the cabin for back taxes. Something cold coiled in Ethan's gut. It wasn't just her story, it was the pattern. He'd seen it before, a system designed to process forms, not save people. Caleb shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but he said nothing. Shadow moved then, standing with quiet precision, his gaze locking on Ethan. It wasn't aggression, it was almost a challenge. Ethan held the stare, understanding the silent message. She's my mission. You said your husband was Army K-9, right? Ethan asked carefully. Laura blinked. How'd you know? Ethan's eyes flicked to Shadow. The way he works a room, checks the air, corners first, then the exits. That's not just instinct, that's training. Laura looked down at Shadow, her expression caught between pride and sadness. Daniel trained him. Shadow was just a pup when Daniel brought him home for off-duty, socializing. When Daniel was killed, Shadow stayed with me. We've been together ever since. The pieces clicked hard in Ethan's mind. This wasn't just a rescue dog. Shadow had a history, a file somewhere, and if the army hadn't updated their records, that file might explain why nobody had officially claimed him. Mason raised an eyebrow at Ethan. You're thinking what I'm thinking? Yeah, Ethan said, his voice low. Somebody lost track of this dog in the system, and if that's true, he's as much a ghost as she is. Laura frowned. What do you mean? Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at Shadow again, at the way the dog's ears twitched toward every sound outside the tent. Then he leaned closer. It means there's more to this than bad paperwork, and I'm not letting it drop. For the first time, Laura's eyes flickered with something like hope. Shadow seemed to sense it too. His tail gave a single, slow sweep against the cot, a quiet vote of confidence. Ethan wasn't sure yet where this road led, but one thing was certain. Shadow had led them into that cabin for a reason, and he wasn't about to ignore it. By mid-morning, the makeshift hospital at Red Haven was already humming with the quiet urgency of a dozen small crises. Laura was resting in a cot, her breathing steadier but her skin still pale. Shadow lay curled beside her, eyes half-lidded, ears twitching to every sound in the tent. Ethan stepped outside, phone pressed to his ear. "Mom, I need you here. Now." Helen Cole didn't need to ask why. She'd spent 30 years as an army nurse, the kind who could dress a shrapnel wound with one hand while writing a patient's name with the other. "Send me the coordinates." "And Ethan, if you're calling me for help, this is serious." "It is," he said. His voice carried the kind of weight she'd heard in soldiers who'd seen too much. Within the hour, Helen's battered SUV pulled up, dust settling around it. She stepped out in boots and a windbreaker, silver hair tied back, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been in enough triage tents to know there was no time for wasted steps. Inside, Maria Lopez, a resource officer for the State Veterans Program, was already sitting with a laptop balanced on her knees. She was small and wiry, with the kind of sharp, no-nonsense voice that could slice through bureaucracy. "You want to keep Shadow with her?" Maria asked, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Then we need to make him official, emotional support animal. With her health, any separation could be dangerous. But we need vet records, a health certificate, and the ESA application, all today." Caleb, who had been leaning against a pole with his arms crossed, shifted uncomfortably. "That's a lot of hoops to jump through. And if he's not vaccinated—" Maria didn't look up. "Then we fix that. Otherwise, some state official could come take him." Ethan glanced at Caleb, expecting another pushback. Instead, the younger man exhaled slowly. "Fine, I'll take him." "You?" Ethan asked, eyebrows raised. Caleb shrugged. "You're needed here, and I've got a good vet in town." He avoided eye contact, as if the admission cost him something. Helen stepped in, already rolling up her sleeves. "Ethan, you get me Laura's medical history, whatever she remembers. I'll get her stabilized enough to handle an interview for the paperwork. Maria, give me the forms. Caleb, keep Shadow safe." Caleb crouched and whistled softly. Shadow looked at Ethan for permission. When Ethan nodded, the dog trotted over, tail wagging once before falling into step beside Caleb. The drive into town was long, the road cut through scrubland and dry creek beds. Caleb kept glancing at the passenger seat, where Shadow sat tall, ears forward, watching the world with that alert, almost human focus. "You're not what I thought you were," Caleb muttered. Shadow tilted his head, as if weighing whether this man was worth a response. At the vet clinic, things moved faster than Caleb expected. The receptionist, seeing Shadow's steady posture and intelligent eyes, ushered them in ahead of a couple of walk-ins. Dr. Harris, a broad-shouldered woman with crow's feet from years of squinting in field clinics, ran her hands along Shadow's ribs, checked his teeth, and listened to his heart. "He's in excellent condition," she said. "Vaccination's up to date. Whoever's been caring for him knows what they're doing." Caleb's eyebrows rose. That'd be Laura. She's sick herself, but she's kept him in perfect shape. The vet smiled faintly. "Sometimes keeping something else alive keeps you alive too." By the time Caleb walked back to the SUV, Shadow had a manila folder of medical records tucked under his collar in a plastic sleeve. The dog jumped in and settled as if he'd done this 1,000 times. Back at Red Haven, Maria's fingers flew over the keyboard again, uploading scans of the records while Helen spoke quietly to Laura. "You'll be fine," Helen said. "We've got the paperwork nearly finished, and if anyone tries to separate you two, they'll have to go through all of us first." Laura reached for Shadow, who pressed his head gently against her hand. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice was steady. "You saved me twice, boy." Ethan watched them, a knot tightening in his chest. Somewhere between the broken-down cabin and this tent, The mission had changed. They weren't just rescuing a woman. They were fighting for the bond that had kept her alive. And Shadow, the dog who had led them through thorns and across dry gullies, was no longer just part of the story. He was the story. The next morning in Red Haven's small welfare office, the air felt thicker than the August humidity outside. Laura sat in the waiting area, Shadow's head resting in her lap, his eyes tracking every movement in the room. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the door as if expecting trouble. Caleb was flipping through paperwork, but clearly not reading a word. Then trouble walked in. A tall man with a buzz cut and a sun-scorched face strode through the door like he owned the place. His voice cut through the low hum of conversation. "Laura." Laura's shoulders stiffened, her hand instinctively tightening around Shadow's collar. "Derek," she said, her voice low. The man's gaze dropped to the dog. "There he is. My dog. Name's not Shadow, it's Gunner, and I'm here to take him back." Ethan stepped forward. "Not happening. You'll need more than a bad attitude to walk out with him." Derek smirked. "I've got papers, adoption contract, microchip records, everything. Shadow." He snapped his fingers. "Come." Shadow didn't move. His ears twitched toward the sound, but his body stayed pressed against Laura's legs. The office fell silent except for the steady thump of Shadow's tail against Laura's chair leg. Maria Lopez, the VA caseworker, appeared from the back office. "Mr. Miles, you'll have your say in the conference room. Both sides will be heard." Inside, the small room smelled of coffee and old carpet. Derek laid out his supposed evidence, a wrinkled adoption form, a blurry photo of himself with a younger, thinner German shepherd. Maria examined it without expression. Then she turned to Laura. Laura spoke slowly, voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. 2 years ago, during the sandstorm in Alamogordo, I found Shadow half buried under collapsed fencing. His paws were raw, his ribs showing. I carried him to shelter in a blanket and fed him with my last rations. He never left my side after that." Ethan slid a folder across the table. "We had Shadow examined yesterday. The vet confirmed scars consistent with neglect, and microchip registration was never updated. Current medical records list Laura as the sole caretaker for over 2 years. Derek's jaw tightened. "So? That doesn't erase the fact he was mine first." Maria looked at him, her tone even. "It does when the animal's welfare was compromised. Abandonment is grounds for forfeiture under state law." Before Derek could argue, Shadow rose to his feet. He walked to the center of the room, glanced at Derek briefly, then padded back to Laura, resting his chin on her knee. It wasn't just loyalty, it was a silent verdict. The room held its breath. Even Caleb, who had once questioned getting involved, exhaled slowly. Maria wrote something on her clipboard and stood. For the record, Shadow will remain with Laura Bennett as her registered emotional support animal. Case closed. Derek shoved his papers back into his folder, muttering under his breath as he stalked out. The door slammed hard enough to make the blinds rattle. Laura's hand shook as she stroked Shadow's fur. "I thought I'd lose him," she whispered. Ethan crouched beside her. "He's not going anywhere. Not while we're around." Shadow leaned into Laura's side, his eyes half closed, as if he knew the fight had ended in his favor. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a thin blade of sunlight cut through the blinds, falling across the three of them. It felt like the first good sign in weeks. The man from the past was gone. But the bond between Laura and Shadow, that was unshakable. By late evening, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the dry metallic tang of a sandstorm rolling in from the desert. Red Haven's streets emptied fast, doors slammed, shutters latched. From the hospital's upper floor, Laura watched the ochre haze swallow the last strip of twilight. Shadow lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every gust, eyes scanning the darkened hallway. Ethan and Caleb had insisted on staying close after the confrontation with Derek earlier that week. Laura had agreed, though she hadn't admitted the truth. She'd been sleeping with one hand on Shadow's collar every night. The storm hit in full force just after midnight. The building groaned under the wind's pressure. Dust seeped through the smallest cracks, coating everything in a fine grit. Outside, the sound was a constant low roar, broken only by the occasional slam of debris against the outer wall. That was when Shadow's head snapped up. His body went rigid, nose lifting toward the door. A growl began deep in his chest, low and steady. Laura frowned, glancing toward the corridor. "What is it, boy?" A faint metallic click came from the stairwell, the sound of a lock turning where no one should be. Shadow surged to his feet, muscles taut, eyes locked on the dark hallway. Ethan was already halfway out of his chair, pistol in hand. "Stay here," he murmured to Laura. But Shadow was already moving, padding toward the sound with silent precision. The figure emerged from the shadows like a nightmare carried on the storm. Derek, goggles pulled low, scarf around his mouth, eyes glinting. He moved fast, a length of rope coiled in one hand, the other reaching toward Shadow. "Come on, Gunner. Time to go home." The words barely left his mouth before Shadow lunged. The force of the impact drove Derek back into the wall with a muffled curse. Rope clattered to the floor. Derek swung wildly, catching Shadow on the shoulder. The dog yelped, but didn't back down, teeth bared, holding his ground between Derek and Laura's room. Ethan's shout cut through the chaos. "Freeze!" But Derek shoved Shadow aside, making for the door. Shadow was faster. With a sharp bark, he launched again, jaws closing on the thick fabric of Derek's sleeve, twisting hard enough to spin the man off balance. Caleb barreled down the hallway, tackling Derek to the ground. The struggle was brief, but vicious. Derek kicking, Caleb pinning him, Ethan wrenching the rope away. The sandstorm outside made the sirens hard to hear until they were nearly at the door. Red Haven PD officers burst in, hauling Derek up by his jacket. One of them shook his head at Ethan. Breaking and entering during a storm, guess he thought no one would notice. Laura knelt beside Shadow, her hands trembling as she checked his shoulder. There was a shallow gash where Derek's ring had caught him, but his eyes were bright, chest still heaving. She cupped his face. "You stayed. You fought for me." Shadow pressed his head into her palm, his tail giving one slow, tired wag. As the police led Derek out into the churning sand, Ethan closed the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. "That's twice now he's tried to take what's yours. He won't get a third shot." Laura looked at Shadow, who had settled at her feet again, his gaze fixed on the doorway as if still guarding it. In that moment, she realized it wasn't just her saving him all those months ago. Shadow had been saving her in ways no one else could. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the three of them sat in a small pool of calm, bound together by something stronger than fear. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving Red Haven coated in a layer of fine sand that glittered under the rising sun. The hospital was quiet, but Laura's phone wasn't. It buzzed with notifications, one after another, calls from friends, messages from strangers, and a flood of emails she hadn't expected. The first one she opened made her stop breathing for a moment. A headline from a local news site. Dog saves owner from armed intruder. Former Marines step in. There was a photo of Shadow, taken some time after the arrest, with Laura crouched beside him, her hand on his collar. His amber eyes seemed to look right into the lens. Within hours, bigger outlets picked it up. The story spread across the state, then beyond it. The dog who wouldn't let go became a headline people clicked on, shared, and donated to. Someone had set up a fund to help Laura with medical expenses and repairs to her home. By the second day, the number had passed $20,000. But it wasn't just the money. Ethan and Caleb showed up that afternoon with tool belts strapped on. Maria from the diner brought trays of sandwiches and coffee for anyone willing to help. Helen, the retired school teacher who lived 2 streets over, arrived with a notebook, organizing shifts and making lists of what was needed. Even Deputy Morales, who usually kept his tone clipped and professional, rolled up in his patrol truck with plywood in the back. "Figured I'd put my carpentry skills to use," he said, tipping his hat toward Laura. "And I wanted to see that dog everyone's talking about." Shadow, as if understanding he was the center of all this, moved among them like he belonged to each of them. He'd stop to lean against a leg here, accept a scratch there, and keep his eyes on Laura as she moved between groups, thanking everyone. The house had taken a beating months ago before the hospital stay. Loose shingles, broken porch steps, a fence barely holding together. That day, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Panels were replaced, steps reinforced, the yard cleared of debris. It was Caleb who brought up the idea. "We should build Shadow a place of his own out back," he said, resting his forearm on a post. "Not just a doghouse, something that tells the story." By evening, the frame for a small shelter stood beside the porch, wide enough for Shadow to stretch out in the shade, with a sloped roof to keep the rain off. Maria showed up again, this time with a can of deep marine blue paint. Laura stood back, watching it take shape. There was a strange twist in her chest. Gratitude, yes, but also disbelief. For so long she'd fought to hold on alone. Now the fight wasn't just hers anymore. Halfway through, Helen walked up with her notebook. "You should see this," she said, handing over a printed page. It was a new donation message. Anonymous, "For the dog who guarded my sister until help came. Years ago. I know what loyalty looks like. Thank you for reminding me." Laura swallowed hard, glancing at Shadow, who was sprawled in the shade, tail thumping against the dirt. By sunset, the house looked less like a place falling apart and more like a home again. The new shelter for Shadow stood proudly beside it, painted and trimmed, with his name carved into a wooden plaque above the entrance. When the last nail was driven in, Caleb leaned back, wiping sweat from his brow. "Looks like you've got a fortress here, Shadow." Shadow walked over, sniffed the new shelter, then trotted to Laura's side and pressed his head into her hip. The quiet way he did it said everything. The local paper came for photos, and though Laura tried to avoid being in them, they insisted. The shot they used on the front page was perfect. Shadow sitting squarely in front of the new shelter, the repaired house behind him, and Laura's hand resting gently on his back. That night, after everyone left, Laura sat on the porch steps with a cup of tea. Shadow lay at her feet, head on his paws, the deep blue of his new shelter glowing faintly under the porch light. "Looks like the whole town's on your team now," she murmured. Shadow didn't move, but his tail tapped once against the wood. Out in the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of laughter from neighbors still talking about the day. And for the first time in a long time, Red Haven felt smaller, warmer, like a place where even the worst storms could pass, and something stronger could grow in their wake. Laura stepped out of Ethan's truck, Shadow close at her side. The house, once dim and lifeless, now glowed with fresh paint, new windows, and the faint scent of cedar from the porch they'd rebuilt together. Inside, laughter from Maria and Helen mingled with the clink of tools being packed away. Signs that this place was alive again. On the porch, Ethan lingered, watching Laura stroke Shadow's head. The dog's amber eyes reflected the setting sun, a quiet sentinel who had fought through pain and fear to stand here, guarding his person. Ethan realized it wasn't just Shadow Laura had saved. It was him, too. The long nights haunted by sandstorms and loss had quieted since he'd stepped into their lives. Shadow curled up by the porch rail, gaze fixed on the horizon as if keeping watch over something unseen. Ethan's voice was low, but carried a smile. "What's your story with a loyal pet? If you've felt the bond of a heart that loves without condition, share it and join us here on the channel to keep their stories alive.